It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I should say I've had a chance today to speak to two friendly audiences. This morning I was at the Red Lion Jantzen Beach to speak to the annual meeting of the National Lime Association, and that's not the citrus producers, that's the people who turn limestone into chemical lime. And so these people are a great group of people, and I'm pleased to be able to speak to you as well. Before I start, I would just want to say something about the Cascade Policy Institute. This is a very important institution in Oregon. You know, we have free market, there are free market public policy institutes in every state. Well, it's not so hard to work on these issues if you're the Texas Public Policy Foundation or the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. But when you get to places like Oregon, this is an uphill battle, right? And Cascade, John Charles and Steve Buckstein and Catherine, who helped arrange the details. I mean, this is a very important organization that has done outstanding work. And of course, John confessed, as he always does, that he spent 20 years working in the environmental movement. He's still atoning, and don't let him forget he's got to really work hard to make full atonement for those years. I should just say, growing up in Baker City and Baker County on a cattle ranch, I learned from personal experience in the 1970s when the environmental movement was getting going that the environmental movement, not environmentalists, not supporters, but the official environmental movement, the big organizations, are the greatest threat to freedom and prosperity domestically that we face, because they don't think that there's a place for human activity in the environment, that locking things up is always better than managing them. So I had the experience 2 summers ago of visiting my family in Baker and standing on the county road for 2 days, watching a forest fire, which was caused by BLM and Forest Service mismanagement, eat up 107,000 acres, including our 2,000 some acres of summer grazing land and 600 acres of commercial timber. And so, this is what's happened with the environmental movement is very serious. It's gotten, as John said, billable hours are more important than protecting the environment. And by the way, I just want to mention Ken Peterson, who's here. I went to the 9th grade with him. I think his family lived in Baker for just a little over a year, and he came up and I recognized him, and I was the one who confirmed that we went to junior high school together. He wasn't quite certain, so it's great to see you, Ken. And it's great to see some people I've known for a long time and some people whose names I've known but I have never met. So it's just great to be here. Thank you. And I look forward afterwards to talking to anyone who can remain and have time for a chat. Now, let me say, and Jim O'Toole is here, who for his sins spent many years on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee working on your behalf on federal lands issues, and is now retired to the area. So it's great to see you all. Now, let me just say, I was not a supporter of Donald J. Trump during the nomination fight. I supported a succession of failed candidates. And I only supported him after he won the nomination, and I never did anything for the campaign, and I certainly never gave it any money. I'm like the people who work for the Cascade Policy Institute. I'm on a nonprofit salary, and I get that every day. In early September, I got a phone, I guess it was late August, I got a phone call from the head of the transition who left a phone message on my phone, which I didn't bother to listen to for about a week. And he invited me to be head of the EPA transition team, which I then started to do from about mid-September on. I mean, both candidates had a transition which is legally constituted, and it gets going in August before the election. So Hillary Clinton's staff had 2 floors of the building we were on in Pennsylvania Avenue, and we had 2 floors. So why did they invite me? I said, when the guy called me up, I said, why are you asking me to do this? Because I'm not an insider. I've never worked inside EPA. I'm not a lawyer who deals with EPA. I don't know how the agency operates. And he said, well, Mr. Trump believes that the federal government needs fundamental reform. I said, well, I agree with that. He said, he believes that the federal government really cannot go on the way it is. And I said, well, I agree with that. And he said, and he thinks that in terms of rebuilding the economy and getting economic growth back to 3%, which we haven't had for 10 years, that the EPA environmental regulations are one of the main obstacles to investing in this country. And I said, well, I agree with that. And he said, and Mr. Trump has even said that he would like to abolish the EPA. And I sort of swallowed hard and I said, well, I agree with that. And he said, well, that's why we've invited you. So I worked from then until January 20th with a team of people whom I recruited. And I got to say this about the Trump campaign and the Trump way of organization. There are some minuses to it, but there are some pluses as well. When the higher-ups in New York at Trump Tower after the election suggested some people to be on my transition team, and I pushed back, they said, okay, it's up to you. They did not force me to take something on. Now, what was the goal of the transition? Because I'm done with that now. The goal was to take, and every agency and every department had a team, right? Well, they missed a few, and we're already seeing the consequences of that. They didn't do NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They didn't do the White House Council on Environmental Quality. We're already seeing the consequences of those bad decisions. But the purpose of the transition teams was to implement every promise that Donald J. Trump made during the course of the campaign. Now, I think you may have noticed, if you followed the campaign, that he was a rather unusual candidate. And of course, he's turning out to be a rather unusual president. But one of the things that made him unusual is that he didn't have his campaign had no policy apparatus. In March of last year, I was asked to speak to a trade association about what energy policy might look like in the next administration. So at this time, Donald Trump was not the nominee, but he was certainly leading, and so I hadn't looked at any of this stuff. You know, I know most of these guys. I've seen them before, and for my sins, I've had to live for many years in Washington, D.C. And so I've seen, you know, like, for example, I know John Kasich. I know he's a nut. I mean, you know, I don't need to watch the debates. So, but I didn't know much about Trump, so I looked at his website. Did anybody look at the Trump website during the course of the campaign? Well, at least during the primary season, there were two buttons you could push on policy. One was called issues and one was policy. If you pushed policy, you got, I think it was 8 3-minute YouTube videos. That was policy. Issues was a list of tweets. Right? Now, the fact that he won is kind of remarkable, isn't it? I mean, when you think about it. Now, most campaigns, and I have been involved in some of these before, particularly Rick Perry, helping write policy papers. And the purpose of the policy papers is to lay out an agenda on a certain issue that sounds really good, but you don't really promise anything. And you qualify those promises so that you don't really have to keep them. Well, Donald J. Trump didn't have that. He gave, starting on May 26th of last year, he gave a series of policy speeches. He'd gone through the entire nominating process. I think May 26th was the day he finally got enough delegates to secure the nomination. That was the day he gave his first policy speech. Before that, it had just been these big rallies and press conferences and stuff. And you know, the rallies were apparently tremendous events, but you know, he just went up on stage and did what I'm doing now, free associating. So His first policy speech was on energy and environmental policy. It was in Bismarck, North Dakota, which is the center of one of the centers of the shale oil and gas revolution. So his speech was on energy and environment, and he laid out a list of promises. Those promises started with getting us out of the Paris Climate Treaty. There was a whole list of things about getting rid of the Obama administration climate agenda, getting rid of all of the rules that had been promulgated at EPA on related to climate, the so-called green power plan, the methane rules, the rule for new power plants, and we can go down the list. And you can go back and read that speech and tot up the promises. And he made some promises about stopping the decline of energy production on federal lands and federal offshore areas, because the shale gas revolution has made the United States, the shale oil and gas revolution has made the United States into the world's energy superpower. And that will only become more apparent as we go on. But it was against everything the Obama administration was trying to do. And so oil and gas production has actually gone down on federal land the last few years. They've been closing off all the offshore areas that were potentially open to oil and gas exploration. And they had a coal leasing moratorium on federal land. And of course, Wyoming is our #1 coal producer. So what is, let me just say, what is behind what President Trump is trying to do? His view, and I don't think this was his alone, but there were several Republican candidates who articulated it, is that the Obama policies are partly responsible, or largely responsible, for the fact that our economy has been stagnant for the last 10 years. It's not just the Wall Street recession, it's the policies that followed it. And I didn't get this at the time, but I think Trump actually learned something during the campaign, and I don't think any of the other candidates did. As I understand it, when he held these huge rallies with tens of thousands of people showing up from out of nowhere into some little rural place, I mean, some of them was just unbelievable. People would drive for, overnight to get there. I'm not quite sure what the excitement was, but he knew how to generate it. One of the things I learned is that after these rallies, well, let me say this, a typical candidate for president has a set speech which he can vary for time, but the content only evolves. He doesn't talk, he just goes somewhere to like this crowd and he gives this little thing and he goes to the next one. And what's it based on? It's based on polling and focus groups. Trump didn't do polling and he didn't do focus groups. What he did was he sat down with Americans and asked them what's wrong with this country? What's wrong in your life? What does the federal government have to do with that? And what he learned is something that we have been pushing, and I think Cascade has been pushing for years. Our resource industries and our manufacturing industries there are hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that is not being made in those industries because of regulation. Let's face it, let me take the worst example. If you have a major hard rock mining project in this country, whether it's on federal land, state land, private land, it can take 10 to 20 years to get it permitted. And oftentimes after those 10 or 15 years, you don't get it permitted. You give up. So in a multi-billion-dollar investment, who is going to do that? Because in Canada, it takes 2 to 5 years to get it permitted. Well, are you surprised that Canada has a lot more mining activity than we do? We can go through other industries and you will find similar things. I think that's the most extreme, but you will find other things. Now, if you look at the parts of the economy that have done okay since the Wall Street panic of 2008, I think you will see it's what I would call the bi-coastal urban elite. And people in Portland, many of them belong to it. It's New York, Washington, D.C., Seattle, Portland, the Bay Area, Los Angeles. It's people who are not involved in digging stuff up, making stuff, and growing stuff for a living. It's people who are in financial markets, who sit in front of computer screens and manipulate information, It's the managerial class. I mean, that's what I do. I sit in front of a screen and So, but the people who grow stuff, dig up stuff, and make stuff, it's not only that they have been forgotten, it's that for a long time, but particularly during the Obama years, federal policy has been designed to do them down. And as I say, I believe hundreds of billions of dollars of investment have not been made in those sectors of the economy that would otherwise be made. What's the consequence of that? Well, if you keep going and you don't invest in something, you eventually get to the level that rural people, for example, are going to be engaged in basket weaving for their living because it doesn't require any capital, right? So if you want a nation of basket weavers, look at what California has done. Okay, yeah, the Bay Area is booming and you can afford a garage in San Francisco for $3 million, but and LA is doing great, but you look at the Central Valley and we're approaching third world standards, right? And this is some of the most valuable agricultural land in the world as long as it has water. You look at the timber industry in Northern California and Oregon, it's been totally destroyed. We now manage our national forests by catastrophic fire, not by human management. Why do people like to go to Europe and visit the forests? Because they're intensively managed, and they have been intensively managed for hundreds of years. So, President Trump learned by talking to all those people in the Rust Belt states that they have been economically stagnated for a long time, and that there are reasons, and some of those reasons come out of Washington, D.C. So the energy and environment agenda of the Trump administration is a key part of the idea that we can get the economy back to 3% economic growth. Now, I just want to go back a little bit and talk about the economics, because I'm not an economist, but one of the things I've noticed, and maybe you've noticed it, as the economy has not grown since the Wall Street panic, it's just been kind of bumping along 1 or 2% per year. The mainstream economics community, that the professors have come up with all kinds of reasons why this is the new normal. We just have to accept it. You know, that's just the way it's going to be from here on out. The economy is just going to grow at 1 or 2%. Well, the result of that is that the divergence between the wealthy people and regular middle class people is getting greater and greater, because wealthy people are doing quite well, right? It's the productive middle class, and if you want to see how these policies at their most extreme, what the result is, look at California. California, the productive middle class has moved out of California. They mostly haven't moved to Oregon because you have high taxes and high regulation and not a whole lot of opportunity. But they're moving to Arizona and Texas and places that are pro-business. So my belief is that we shouldn't accept that we can't have 3% economic growth. Let's try it. Now, I don't think all of the Trump policies are well designed to get that. For example, I think Cascade is too. We're a free trade organization. We're not trade protectionists. We believe that trade is good at both ends, the buyer and the seller. And the international borders don't matter very much, because, like, if you're in business, well, if you're a consumer here, you don't buy everything that's made in Oregon. I mean, you die if you try. I mean, there's not enough stuff. I mean, look, there is. I mean, you know, each part of the world or each community is good at something and it concentrates on it, and another place, so you trade. So we think trade is good. So I'm worried about the Trump trade policies, but I think that the energy and environment agenda can have tremendous results, because let me tell you, the United States, I think as many of you know, is now the world's largest producer of oil and gas. We have the world's largest coal supplies, by far. And in Wyoming, it's incredibly cheap to mine coal, because unlike in Appalachia, where the seams might be 3 to 6 feet deep, in Wyoming they're 100 feet deep, right? So we have this incredible resource because of the shale oil and gas revolution, which was not done by government. It was done by a guy named George Mitchell down in Texas, who tinkered for about 20 or 30 years, and nobody believed him. But he said, I know this will work. I know I can combine hydraulic fracturing, a technology from the 1940s, with horizontal drilling and technology from, I think, probably the 1980s, and smart sensing technology, a brand new kind of thing. I can combine these, and I can get oil and gas out of rock. Because remember, oil and gas, typically, it's in a pool under rock, and you drill down and you tap the pool and pump it up. Shale, you actually get it out of the rock without taking the rock up and pulverizing. You get it out of the ground and pull it up through fracking. So George Mitchell did that. That is the biggest energy revolution of our lifetimes, and it wasn't done by government. It wasn't planned. It happened because of free people responding to the incentives provided by free markets and by having the intelligence and the persistence to do it. Government could never do something like that, right? Ever. That's government wants to manage things. It doesn't want to invent things. So I think there is a tremendous opportunity. We will not only become the world's energy superpower, we're now exporting 900,000 barrels of oil per day, right? We're still importing oil, yeah, because there's different types of oil and it's needed in different places for different types of refineries. But we're going to become a huge exporter of oil, gas, and even coal if the governors of Oregon or Washington would relent and allow a coal export terminal to be built here. That's good, right? But the other thing is, this gives this country a huge price advantage for manufacturing. Any energy-intensive industry now is going to have a huge advantage over any other place in the world. Because we have hundreds of years of natural gas. We have hundreds of years of coal. This can provide the United States, because remember, what goes into making something? It's labor, capital, and resources. Well, the main resource in most manufacturing is energy. So what's happened since, and I gotta stop here soon. I'm gonna stop soon. What's happened since 2007 with the fracking revolution? In 2007, when fracking first got going, we elected President Obama, and the first thing he did was he said we need cap and trade. And so in 2009, the Waxman-Markey bill narrowly passed the House, and then it was never taken up in the Senate because the blowback by the American people was so strong. Well, I mean, this is kind of amusing. I'll go back to that time because I was deeply involved in it, and I remember watching it happen because we were fighting Waxman-Markey against most of corporate America, which supported it, including most of the big oil companies, including ExxonMobil. No, ExxonMobil did not support Waxman-Markey, I'm sorry. They supported a carbon tax, and they still support a carbon tax. But most of the big companies supported cap and trade. Harry Reid announced before the 4th of July recess, right after the vote in the House, that the Senate would take up cap and trade and pass it before the August recess. So after they came back from the 4th of July recess, they would pass cap and trade in the Senate. The blowback all across America, including areas like this, was so strong that when Harry Reid came back, he announced that we will put on the shelf for the moment cap and trade, and we will turn to the less controversial issue of health care reform. So, well, that didn't work out too well. Maybe they should have spent the month not passing cap and trade. But anyway, that's history. So the energy revolution in this country is going to give the United States an unbelievable competitive edge for as far as the eye can see if we only take advantage of it. And to just give you one example, the chemical industry, and I said many companies supported cap and trade. This is how I got here. I wanted to tell you this. In 2009, there was this big corporate organization called the Climate Action Partnership to push cap and trade. And one of the top 3 people in that was Andrew Liveris, the head of Dow Chemical. He's an Australian. He's a very clever man. Why was Dow Chemical pushing cap and trade? Because not only does it take a lot of energy to make chemicals, but the feedstock for most bulk chemicals is ethane, which is one of the ingredients of natural gas. Well, we were in 2007 and 8, we were running out of natural gas in this country, and the price was going up and up. And Andrew Liveris arranged a business plan to move all of their bulk chemical manufacturing offshore. They arranged something like a $12 or $15 billion investment from the Kuwait government to build a massive chemical cracker in Kuwait, because they have a lot of natural gas that they flare. They have no use for it. And to move that, all of their operations overseas, by passing cap and trade, that would put all of the domestic competitors who weren't smart enough to move overseas out of business, right? Because natural gas, the price was just going up and up. Well, I don't know if you've noticed, Andrew Liveris is now a big guy in the White House Trump circles, right? Why? Because Dow's strategy is now to move all of their bulk chemical production to the United States and out of Europe because of cheap natural gas. So, you know, it's interesting how the world turns here. I guess I shouldn't, before I stop, I should say a little bit about the Paris Climate Treaty. I've spent the last 3 months doing nothing, and my team at CEI, which is the largest free market environmental team in the country, it's 6 people. Well, you know, I want to say this. I've got a handout here, and it's got, well, let me get it. I think I put this in. Yeah, I call it the correlation of forces. And on one side, I've got 10 environmental groups. Their annual budget is more than $1 billion a year. If you add up the top 50 environmental groups, their annual budget is more than $3.5 billion a year. On the free market environmental side, I didn't include the state groups like Cascade. But in DC, we've got CEI at 6, the Heritage Foundation, which is a more than $100 million year organization. They got 3 people working on this kind of stuff, and so on. You add up all the people in DC working in the nonprofit world from our free market perspective on environmental issues, it's fewer than 50 people. So if we had a $1 billion budget, my salary would be like 2 orders of magnitude larger than it is. So you see what the correlation of forces is not good here. And when we got it was a key part of President Trump's campaign agenda, his energy and environment agenda, to get us out of Paris. But as soon as he got elected, the forces of darkness started to lean on him. And many of those people, I said it was, you know, a campaign, it was a fight between the promise breakers and the promise keepers, or you might put it between the swamp and the deplorables. And unfortunately, there are a number of swamp creatures in the Trump administration. I don't know why he wants them there, but he's got them. So there was a big fight within the administration, and I spent the last 3 months working on this. It's very important that he decided last Thursday, despite the attacks from everyone, all the world's leaders, the entire foreign policy establishment, all the Republican elders and bigwigs, some people in his own cabinet, his own daughter. In fact, Jim Inhofe, Senator Inhofe, who's of course a great champion of ours. He's one of the great men of the Senate, and he's of course a total global warming skeptic. Jim Inhofe said a number of years ago, after holding a bunch of hearings as Senate EPW chairman, he said, he announced that he thought that global warming may be the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people. Now, what did he mean? He didn't mean that he disagrees that the climate is warming and that human beings have something to do with it. It's that the hoax is that it's a crisis that should require us to turn the economy upside down for solutions that won't work or have any effect. So Jim Inhofe was asked at a private meeting that I was at on Wednesday, and he said, by somebody who's on our side, but asked him, does President Trump, is he really with us? Does he believe that global warming is a hoax? And Inhofe said immediately, he said, oh, yeah, as long as his daughter's not in the room. So I think why is, maybe we'll wait till questions to explain why Paris is so important. But the point is, it's an international commitment that the Obama administration made. They did not submit it to the Senate for ratification as they constitutionally should have been required to do. They pretended, although it's the most important thing that's ever happened in the world, it doesn't rise to the level of being a treaty. It's just an executive agreement between pals. No other country in the world thought that. Every other country in the world went through their normal ratification or acceptance procedures. We were the only country that did not. So President Trump has pulled us out. Why? Because we made an international commitment to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2025. All of the regulatory actions undertaken without the support of Congress or legislation would only get us halfway there. All of the Obama agenda would only get us halfway there. President Trump is undoing most of that agenda, so we're a long ways away from meeting our Paris commitment. Well, the other side just totally changed their story. They said, oh, well, it's just voluntary, you don't need to do it, it's just aspirational. Well, for most countries it is. China promised to peak their emissions by 2030. Well, their business as usual scenario shows that their emissions will peak before 2030. So they have undertaken nothing that requires any economic sacrifice. And of course, if you believe the environmentalists, this is all free. You know, every time you build a windmill, you're making money. And if you believe that, I got some windmills to sell you. So the United States does not make commitments lightly, right? And one of the reasons we don't, because we're an honorable nation that in most respects, let's not get too carried away, but in most respects. But the other thing is that we're the only country in the world where private citizens can go into federal court and enforce things against the federal government. Not only our laws, but our international agreements. So if President Trump had not withdrawn from the Paris Climate Treaty, the environmentalists, and for example, New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, we have a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act released email in which he lays out the strategy for blocking the Trump administration's EPA deregulatory agenda. And one of the things that they're going to argue is, well, we've signed on, this is part of our commitment under Paris. You can't take this stuff back. You can't get rid of the so-called Clean Power Plan. So I'll end with that, and I'll just say, here's what the global warming debate is about. And I think some of in the room, like Jim Carlock, our videographer, and Bob Zybach and Gordon Folks know about this. John Christie put this together. Here's what the global warming debate is, and I have it in a handout here. It's modeling versus data. The models all predict a lot of warming. The data shows a tiny little bit of warming. So who are you going to believe, the models or the data? Your lying eyes. Well, the global warming alarmist community says, well, we believe the models. There's something deeply wrong here. And I think we need to think very seriously, because this is indicative of a much deeper problem in our scientific establishment and in our public discourse, that they could actually say with a straight face. Of course, they don't say it. You have to infer it from what they say. They don't say, oh yeah, I believe the model's not what the data says, right? There's something deeply wrong about this entire debate, and it's indicative, I believe, of a much deeper problem. And I would say one of the things that the Trump agenda is going to need to look at is how to reform the misuse of science in the regulatory processes at EPA and at other agencies. This is a very serious problem. It's going to take a huge effort to do, and I hope that some people in the administration will take it on. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for having me. Wow, lots of questions. You're first.
Do you think that Trump understands that last point, that they're following the model, not the data, probably in many other things too, you know, not just climate change? They probably have predictions on homelessness, they probably have their predictions on healthcare.
Right.
So does he understand that they have two information streams, one of which is just made up?
Well, I hope so. He's a pretty shrewd individual. He has some practical experience of environmental regulation as a builder of resorts and hotels, and I think he understands some of the games that the regulators play. I know that there are people in the administration who get this 100%, but there are a lot of things that look more pressing. And one of the things that disturbs me about the Trump administration is how slow they have been to fill the subordinate jobs, the second and third tier jobs. There's no deputy EPA administrator yet. There's no assistant administrator for air and radiation or for water. I mean, these are important jobs. We don't have an assistant secretary at Interior for Fish and Wildlife and Parks, which administers not only the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Park Service, but also the Endangered Species Act. We don't, and I could go down the list, but I think there's one of the things is there's some good people in the administration, but they don't have enough of them yet, and we're not going to be able to. They're not going to be able to take on the long-term reforms that are necessary that require a huge amount of effort if they're relying on career civil servants in these jobs, because the career civil servants are opposed to the agenda. Now, yes.
Do you have any insight into why it's taking so long to fill those positions?
Yes, I do, and it's not a pretty story. I've been told that the Office of Presidential Personnel in the White House has 20 people in it. Previous administrations in the early months had 80 to 110 people in it, and that not a single one of these people has ever done presidential personnel before. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that's what I've heard. So they're not taking it seriously, and I think it goes back to the campaign. They were very proud of the fact that Trump won the election with 80 people in Trump Tower and Hillary Clinton had 900 over in Brooklyn. And I don't know if that had anything, maybe they succeeded despite that, I mean, but they think that, leaner is better, and they seem to think that they can run the entire federal government out of the White House, which ain't gonna work. And Jim O'Toole, as I pointed out, was over on the Senate committee, and he knows that. And I hope you're nodding your head, Jim. Yes.
Of course, the left cast Trump as a buffoon and not the shrewd individual that you observed. But talk about his team. What's your perception of people like Rick Perry and Scott Pruitt for their skill, their talent, and commitment to doing the right thing?
Well, I know Scott Pruitt, and I know Rick Perry, and in fact, I supported Rick Perry for president twice, and boy, am I glad he didn't win. Shows you what I know, what my judgment is. Scott Pruitt was the Attorney General of Oklahoma. He's a very capable lawyer, and he's a very capable politician. And I think he brings legal skills and political skills to his agency. And I think you've already seen that. He's gotten off to a fast start. The executive orders came down to start to reopen these rules, the Waters of the U.S. rule, for example. And he has really gotten the team going, even though he doesn't have any confirmed positions under him. He has this team of appointees, but they're not in the confirmed positions, like assistant administrator and general counsel. So, I think what he lacks is experience of managing a big agency. I mean, he's a lawyer. He's worked in a law firm, and he's run a baseball team, and he's run a minor league baseball team, and he's been attorney general. But so that's why I think it's so important at EPA that they get a deputy administrator and the various assistant administrators who have the management experience to fill in to complement him. Now, Rick Perry has already gone native. Rick Perry hadn't been in town for 2 months before he said, well, I think we ought to stay in Paris. Why? Because he went to the G7 energy ministers meeting, and they'd all, oh, Rick, you're a really good part of the club here. You're going to be a really important person as long as you go along with us and not the president. I turned on the TV last night when I got here in my hotel room to see the British election results. And there was Rick Perry saying a week after the president made his announcement that he thought it was a mistake. So there's, it's really easy to get into the, once you get to the swamp, it's really easy to join it. That's what I've learned. Now, I'm going to go from table to table here. So I've done, yeah.
Probably heard that despite Trump's decision to withdraw from the accord, there's 25 or so mayors of American cities who decided, we're still in. What do you think of their chances?
Well, two things. I think it's, if any state, city, or county wants to follow policies to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, fine. Now, California's been doing it for a long time. What is the result? Their economy's in the tank. Their emissions have gone down, but if you actually look at what's happened, their emissions have actually gone up, but they now have electric rates twice as high as the national average. But what they've done is they have pushed all of their energy-intensive part of their economy out. They now outsource all of their energy-intensive goods. So they actually haven't reduced their emissions, they've just put them outside the state. And you see this if you followed their rules on diesel trucks, the trucking industry. And maybe you've noticed this, all the trucking companies that can have moved to Nevada, Arizona, or even Oregon. And what do? They drive hundreds of miles every day to get to the job because it's cheaper than remaining in California. Does that reduce emissions? So I think, these California and Oregon and I mean, the idea that a hydropower state that hydro doesn't count as a renewable shows you how totally crazy you are here. I think that's fine, but it's unconstitutional for them to enter in to engage in their own foreign policy. So they can, the administration, the Department of Justice is going to have to step in and say, hey, you can't be making these agreements and saying that you're part of the Paris Treaty. You can do whatever you want in your state, but the Constitution reserves foreign policy, diplomacy, and military to the federal government. So I think that's, now I'm going to go over here and I'm going to start back. Yes?
Regarding Paris, pulling out of Paris, what consideration was given to the potential that all of the rest of the world would not take well to us pulling out, and what consideration was given to the potential for retaliation in various ways?
Yeah, well, I think that was one of the things arguing for us to stay in, and I think at the end of the day, President Trump decided that his agenda, that pulling out of Paris is a key part of achieving his agenda, and that the foreign countries are huffing and puffing, but there isn't really much behind it, and I agree with that. Look, most of the countries that belong to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and joined the Kyoto Protocol and now the Paris Treaty, most of them have never undertaken any commitments to reduce their emissions. The only countries that have undertaken commitments to reduce their emissions are the European Union, a few other countries like Norway and Switzerland, Canada, the United States, Japan, and Australia. Chinese emissions under Paris will peak by 2030. Chinese emissions surpassed U.S. emissions in 2006 and are now roughly double those of the United States. Now, per capita, they're still way below us because they got 4 times as many people. But their emissions are now twice those of the United States. India has said we will be happy to reduce our emissions, but not at the expense of our efforts to electrify the country so that the hundreds of millions of people who don't have any electricity and the hundreds of millions of people who have very little electricity can enjoy the benefits of modern technological civilization. So India has said we'll be happy to reduce our emissions as long as the developed countries pay for it. Because India has not bought the idea that all this stuff is free, right? It has huge costs, unbelievable costs. Now, the other thing I want to say about this is I think President Trump has shown his global leadership by pulling out of Paris. Because if you're marching in the wrong direction, that's not leadership.
That's right.
Now let me say this about what I believe the global warming scam is all about. We continually hear that the solution to reducing emissions is renewable energy. Well, after decades of mandates and subsidies for renewable energy, decades of huge government subsidies, not only in this country, but Germany, Spain, Denmark, Britain. Wind and solar provide less than 1% of the world's energy supply. And global demand for energy is going up 2% per annum. How much of the world's energy each year additionally is going to be provided by wind and solar? So let's take 2%, maybe 1/20th of it every year. So where is that other 19 parts, that other 95% going to come from every year? It's going to come from coal, oil, and natural gas. Now, there is one alternative. If you really believe that global warming is a crisis that requires immediate action, then you should support a crash effort to install nuclear reactors all around the world. All these environmental pressure groups, some of them say that's right, but most of them say, oh, it's the greatest crisis ever faced by the planet and humanity, but we couldn't actually do the one thing that would solve it. Instead, we have to throw money down the hole and subsidize wind and solar. It would be cheaper to take that money and put it in the ground where it could rot. Because every time, the purpose of a subsidy is usually to decrease the price of something. But because wind and solar are only part of the total electric supply, every time you increase the amount of wind and solar in the system, you increase the price of electricity. So the purpose of the subsidy is to increase the price of electricity, not to decrease it. Therefore, you would be better off to take that money and bury it and just let it rot. From an economic standpoint.
Rotting money would add to the carbon.
Yeah, there's natural gas produced, yes. Okay. And then Chuck, I'm going to get to you.
I wanted to get back to your framing the debate as data versus modeling.
Yeah.
And I like to think of it as kind of a triangle where you have climate science at the top and then you have policy and politics at the base. But all of the discussion, whether it's in the papers, the news, the media, whoever, is between policy and politics.
Yeah.
And, I listened to Scott Pruitt recently on the Sunday Fox News report, and he was asked, what about the science? Or he wasn't asked that directly, but it was inferential.
Right.
And he never got into that. So shouldn't we have some kind of a public debate? Steve Koonin, former physicist and a former Obama energy advisor. He wasn't there the second term, but he was the first term.
Right.
He says we should have a blue team and a red team talking about this nationally. Now, why aren't we addressing that aspect of it?
Yeah, well, the two-team idea is something that Fred Singer and I proposed back in around the time of Kyoto, around 1997. So it's been around a long time. And some other people are involved in that. Look, I don't know. Look, this is a very complicated issue as to how you can take science into the public debate without both corrupting the science and the public debate. People always talk that politics is ruining science, but it goes both ways. Science in this country is now being used to corrupt our politics. So there's a huge problem here, and I don't know how to answer it. And I think that Scott Pruitt and others are afraid of talking about climate science because whenever they do, they get attacked as morons, even though the people on the other side who say things that are 20 times stupider never get attacked. I mean, that representative from Georgia, Hank Johnson, he said that global warming was going to cause Guam or something to tip over. I mean, now, look, I would just say this about this. I read these specialized publications, and a few of you may do. Greenwire comes out every day, and it's meant to cover all of energy and environment, everything that's going on in the debate. Once this week, they had about 5 stories in a row about science, and it was something could cause something else. Something could happen. Every one of them was not science. It was predictions from some scientists who said, well, that could happen. Well, because I've done a study that shows that it could happen. Well, you can't base things in the public debate on a series of this could happen, and then this could happen, and then this could happen, and then this could happen. I mean, if you actually followed that down, you would soon be insane. So, Chuck?
Yeah, you were right when you said that the modeling versus observations is the way the modeling community and the climate establishment is treating this. They choose to believe the modeling over the data. But one of the things that I'm extremely concerned about, and I think Gordon is too, is the integrity, the lack of integrity now that we're actually seeing in science. Because what these people are doing is they're extremely disappointed in the failure of the effort they put into climate modeling. It doesn't work. And so now we're seeing that NASA GIS and NOAA both are actually manipulating the climate records and falsifying things so that they can match the record up to the modeling so that they can continue to perpetrate these lies. And it's dangerous because right now the only really reliable data set we have for the climate records, because of what they've already done, is the satellite record. So I guess what I'm asking you is, since President Trump is probably going the right way with this, is there anybody that's going to call his attention to this and have some sort of a team get put together to get rid of these people at NASA GIS and NOAA who are manipulating the records and destroying them and trying to protect their little fiefdoms that they've had richly rewarded under Obama? In other words, bring the integrity of science back so that we know what the truth is. Because right now, we've seen it, they're erasing the past climate records to match them up to models.
Yeah, here's the Christie Spencer satellite data from '79, which they tease out of the weather satellite data. And Roy Spencer and John Christie figured out how to do that. And one of the things I would point out to you is there's another team that does that called Remote Sensing Systems, and they started up because they thought, Frank Wentz thought that the Christie Spencer data was not supporting the global warming agenda, and they must be cooking it somehow. Actually, up until recently, the remote sensing data, their reconstruction, showed less warming than the Christie Spencer did. But my point of mentioning that is the great thing about the satellite data is not only that it's a lot more reliable and it covers the whole globe, unlike the surface data, because there's large parts of the world, like the oceans, that don't have a whole lot of weather stations, and Africa has very few, for example. But these are private, right? The government isn't doing this. These are private people. Now, they get government grants, yeah, but they're doing it. The second thing is they're completely open about it. Christie and Spencer, somebody came up with showed that they were not fully taking into account one part of the orbital decay of the satellites. And they looked at it and they said, yeah, you're absolutely right, thank you. Now, how does the government do it? They defend to the death the phony junk science that they produce. They never admit. Now, one of the problems at EPA is the secret science. You know, all of these Clean Air Act regulations are based on not the direct benefits of getting rid of an air pollutant, but on a collateral benefit, a co-benefit called fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5 microns. And so the mercury rule is a great example. You've got a few $1 million of direct benefits of the mercury rule, which are based on modeling that there are 200 and some indigenous pregnant fisherwomen who catch and eat 100 and some pounds of fish out of the most polluted rivers in the United States every year. They've never been able to find a single individual, but their models tell them that there should be such people. So you got a few $1 million of direct benefits, you've got many billions of dollars of costs, and then you've got many, many, many billions of dollars of alleged benefits from reducing PM 2.5. Well, we already have standards for PM 2.5 that the EPA says get us to the right level for protecting health. Why do we need to go beyond that? Well, they say every incremental decrease in PM 2.5 has an equivalent health impact. Well, first of all, that's crazy. It's insane. There is no difference between 100 parts per billion and 50 parts per billion, right? But moreover, they don't have any science that they base it on. They have a black box. It's called the Harvard 6 Cities study. It's a very large-scale epidemiological study, and the Pope study, a similar study. They will not reveal the data or the methodology. Trust us, we're the government. Now, if those studies actually supported their claims, they would release the data and the methodology. I mean, it's obviously a phony job that is costing the American people hundreds of billions of dollars over time. And when you take that money out of the economy for phony health benefits, that has real results. People who can't afford medical care, who can't meet their bills, who can't afford better food that will make them healthier. I mean, there are all kinds of things that we can say that when you take money out of people's pockets, it has direct negative consequences for their health and welfare. And we're just throwing money based on, trust us, we've got this black box. So this is a huge problem. The problem I mentioned earlier, NOAA has the data, and NOAA is manipulating or allowing the temperature surface data to be manipulated. And as I said earlier, one of the problems in the transition is they missed a few government departments, and one of them is they didn't have anybody doing planning for NOAA. So they don't have an administrator yet. This is a problem. Okay, now I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to take a couple questions at a time, because I think we're actually out of time, and John and Steve will tell me, and Catherine. So why don't you two each ask a question, and then I'll do the same thing back there, and then I'll do the same thing here.
I was curious if you see any prospects for a change in management of public federal lands in the western United States.
I hope so. I've been working on some of these issues for a very long time, since the early 90s, and I think Secretary Zinke is not the right man for the job, but I think some of the people that they're putting in the subordinate positions are, and I hope Secretary Zinke will follow the lead of the people who have the experience and the expertise. I mean, I think he's a well-intentioned man. He just doesn't have. He comes from Montana. He grew up hiking in the national parks. He thinks federal lands are mostly about hunting and fishing and recreation, and they are. They're partly about that. But there's a huge number of people in the rural West whose economic future depends upon producing stuff from the federal lands, grazing animals, producing timber, minerals, and energy. So, and have I left anything out? I hope so.
Yeah, about the transition issue, what happened to the infrastructure from the previous Bush administration? Has it evaporated? Are they not trusted by the Trump administration?
There were some people who had experience in the Bush administration, but my experience of those people is they're not trustworthy. Look, let me just say this about the Bush administration. No, look, the whole Bush kind of attitude towards government is, first of all, it's very condescending. It's our duty to help govern the poor peons who don't know better. But the second thing about the Bush administration that I really didn't like is, on a lot of these issues, their policy was, if we ignore it, it will go away. And the classic example of that is climate, global warming. Remember, the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated by President Clinton in '97. He never sent it to the Senate, and President George W. Bush never sent it to the Senate, but they continued to participate in the global warming powwows and all the efforts. And my friend Harlan Watson, who was on the transition and who was I recruited him. He was the senior climate negotiator for 7.5 years of the Bush administration. So there were Bush people. But, if you ask Harlan, what was it like to be the senior climate negotiator for 7.5 years, and he has a 2-word answer: unmitigated hell. He's a rather blunt person, not your typical diplomat. So what happened? How did that strategy work out? We're going to ignore the problem and it will go away. Well, after 8 years, President George W. Bush went away, and the problem sprang right back. By December of 2009, less than 1 year after he'd left office, we had the Copenhagen climate powwow, where we were going to have this huge agreement to save the world. Thank God it collapsed. But we got out of it, for example, the Green Climate Fund, which is something Secretary Hillary Clinton thought up, which is to redistribute $100 billion a year from the developed countries to the developing countries. Our share of that is $22 billion a year. Do we have time for a couple more?
One more.
One more? God, how can I choose?
Power.
The people in the back never get to ask anything. Look, I can talk to you afterwards. So let me pick you.
Me?
You.
Oh, okay. when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement recently, you know, both Exxon Mobil and ConocoPhillips both came out in support and said it was a bad idea. And of course, Rex Tillerson, who's now in, also was a supporter of,
Right.
of that agreement. So what is their motivation there? I can't quite figure that one out.
Well, it varies from company to company. Let me say, BP and Shell are European companies, and they have to do what Europe says, the European governments say, or they can't do business. Now, we haven't gotten to that point yet in this country. So why does ExxonMobil support a carbon tax? And why do they support the Paris Climate Treaty? Well, this is a long story, and it may not be totally convincing, and I'm not sure it is, but let me give you some evidence. Lee Raymond was chairman and CEO of ExxonMobil, and when the price of oil went down to something like $12 a barrel, he acquired a company almost as big as ExxonMobil. And within a year, the price of oil had gone back up, and he had made his shareholders a fantastic amount of money. So when Rex Tillerson became chairman and got off the climate realist bus and got on the climate alarmist bus, at that point in 2006 and 2007, the price of natural gas was going up, and people were saying we're running out of it. And in fact, we started to permit LNG import terminals so that liquefied natural gas could be landed in this country to supply our market. Well, LNG costs a lot more than natural gas in a pipeline, right? So the idea was that gas is going to be up at $10 or $12, and we're running out of it. Well, Exxon has the world's largest private reserves of natural gas, but in 2007, it occurred to Rex Tillerson and his board that they weren't invested in the new thing, the shale gas revolution. Now, if you'd been thinking more clearly, you would have realized that the shale gas revolution was going to drop the price of natural gas from $7 or $8 to $2 or $3 within a few years. But Exxon had been not involved in it. It was all the small companies that were doing shale. There was a big company in the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania called XTO. And ExxonMobil, see, Rex Tillerson thought, well, I got to do something as big as Lee Raymond did. He bought Mobil, and he made his shareholders a fortune, and he's a really important guy. I want to do that too. I'm just speculating here, but I think there's some basis for it. So they bought XTO, and within 3 or 4 years, the company was worth a tiny fraction of what they'd paid for it because the price of gas had gone from $8 to $2. So they're sitting on this huge reserve of natural gas that isn't worth very much. And how do you make it worth something? You get rid of coal. Coal is more carbon intensive, much more carbon intensive than natural gas. So if you want to reduce emissions, you get rid of coal and replace it with natural gas. In fact, I've said this before, a wind farm is really just a natural gas plant. Because what you got is you can order a standard gas turbine, or you can order a gas turbine with a bunch of windmills in front. Because in fact, what you're getting is a gas turbine, because the windmills don't produce very much energy. So Lee Raymond made a fortune for the shareholders. Rex Tillerson has cost them a fortune, and they've been trying to get it back ever since. That is my belief about why ExxonMobil has gone where it is. You kill coal. That's the whole point. Thank you very much.